Hi, this is Karen from Soterion, and you're listening to the SAP Security and GRC podcast with host Dudley Cartwright, helping you on your journey to effective access risk management in SAP. In today's episode, we'll explain the phrase access risk is business risk and advise why business users are better suited to be the owners of access risk rather than IT. We'll also provide a list of actions to enhance business buy-in and accountability of access risk management activities. We'll be joined by Emile Steyn from Soterion and Quintus Hougaard from Linkies Consulting. Thank you for joining us.
So guys, maybe just to begin, the statement there of access risk is business risk, I guess that's come about because for many organizations, the responsibility of access risk management has fallen on the organization's IT teams. And I think a lot of the time it's due to the complex nature of SAP security, also the complex or technical nature of the GRC or access control solutions that make these access risk management activities quite difficult for the business users. And the more complex or the more technical they are, often the more business resistance you have to these type of activities. And ultimately that responsibility ends up lying with the IT teams. So the audit fraternity obviously have an issue with this. They say or believe that it is not the best way for an organization to manage their risk, that the IT is responsible or accountable for access risk. They're saying it's business risk. The business must be responsible for it. They must take accountability for it. Maybe then just to start off with, Quintus, do you want to why are the business users better suited to be the owners of the access risk? Why is access risk considered business risk?
I think two things that you brought up. You brought up firstly is the accountability. Like you said rightly, so the auditors say the accountable business is accountable for it. So to get that responsibility and accountability at the same point, that's where it should lie. You also talked about the challenges. That you talked about technical that. It's quite technical and there's a bit of resistance for business, but there's also the business awareness towards risk that differs at different departments and different industries. So the idea of having the business owner risk, and that's where like the tie hits the road. That's where the most informed decision can be made about risk. Many times we found that the business owners are also they're responsible for the controls. So you can't have a person responsible for the controls but not being for the risk, not accountable for the risks. So that's why those two join, and that happens normally with the tie to road, and that's where the business is, and not an IT department, where by default it all normally ends to. So it's a valid concern from the auditor's fertility.
And I suppose then for many organizations, they've had super users or key users that have been with the organization for 15, 20 years. Those users have got a very good understanding of the business, of the area, and the business process associated with that area, the risks associated with that area. So, they are very well placed. The business users are very well placed to make those decisions as to whether the ability to maybe create a purchase order and release a purchase order. It's the business users that are best placed to understand what that risk impact is on the organization compared to possibly some users within IT who don't have necessarily a sort of holistic view of the organization and what potentially the risk impact of some of those access risk violations could be to the organization.
That's also often why we use the three lines of defense to explain this, to customers and say, the organizational users is typically your first line of defense. And because of their knowledge, that should be your strongest point. So after organizational users, you don't want to be have audits or the risk departments flagging items. You want to enable those people that know the business the best. You want to enable them to make those more effective decisions. So the question, I guess, then is, how do we do that?
Dudley, in terms of if the business that knowledge that you said of a person being for 30, 20 years in the company, I think it's very important that you get the business actually also to capture that knowledge, because sometimes those people leave, and that's controls and risks that's lying in the business, and they've got all this knowledge, and without a tool or where to capture this and where to get this information recorded, we normally use the words, we're going to harvest that knowledge from the business and put it in, and that's where that knowledge to make the informed decision is captured also, by giving them the ownership and then getting that documented around those risk and controls.
Yeah, definitely. Emile, just maybe getting back to your point there of the 3 lines of defense, and I guess if you're going to empower your business users, which would be your first line of defense, if you were to use an analogy of a sort of an army, those are people, as Quintus said, that's where the tire hits the ground. Those are the people that are on the front line. They're seeing how stock moves through the warehouse, etc. They have a good understanding of it. And it's also just for an organization, it just means you've got more people on the front line if you can empower your business users, where if you're relying solely on your second line of defense, which would be your IT, your risk and compliance departments, or external audit, it's a much smaller set of people that are then empowered to try and identify the risks. So for an organization, if you can empower a large number of people, business users, to be risk aware and looking for things that look wrong or don't look suspect, etc., a much stronger position for the organization to be in, rather than just relying on a few people sitting in a risk and compliance department or waiting for the annual external audit to take place. If we move then to possibly the next question is, so why traditionally has it been so difficult for organizations to get the business users to become accountable? Why is this an activity that often sits with IT and hasn't been successfully, in many occasions, sort of that responsibility shifted to the business users, where there's proper business buy-in, business accountability of access risks? What are some of the challenges that we've seen?
Yeah, I'll maybe start with that one. And so Quintus already mentioned ownership, and I think it's often that we see that how risks are being presented to the business, that it's not being provided to them in a usable format. So, and part of that is that the rule set that is being used. So we've mentioned in other sessions that the rule set is effectively the risks that's important to the business. So, and allowing them to make a decision on whether the risk is important to them, that will enable them to take ownership. And what we have seen is, with using a generic tool or generic rule set, is often those rule sets are not applicable to the business, and that makes it very difficult then for them to take ownership and effectively make decisions on that.
Also, it is definitely the technicality in how it's presented, but there's also different risk awareness, as I mentioned earlier, on different departments. Dudley, you were mentioning, that the warehouse guy is fully aware of the stock movements and stuff. I love the example of a client I've been at, where the warehouse manager, once we made it visible, coming back to Emile's point, the visibility of who had access to which movement types, and he realized who can write stock off and who can do good receipts and who can move stuff around. Once he knew that, and we made it visible, this guy was like really taking ownership, and he was like defending his movement types like a lioness defending his cups. Nobody gets access to my critical movement types. I can see who they are and I'll take control of it. That tremendously helped to just push that control over, and he had visibility. Previously he didn't know who had access to which movement types. And then I'm coming also from the SD background, from a functional consultant. And I challenged always with the marketing guys, these guys were just chasing marketing figures out there, they weren't worried about risk. It's the last thing in their mind, and I find the same in the production guys. Production guys chase production figures. That's what they measured against. So they know that they measure against how much they sell, how much produced. So risk is not on in their radar at all. So now you're bringing something to them. Number one, they can't understand because it's something the IT is pushing on them. But where I do find is, back to Emile's point also, the various levels of if you present it right, but also certain people like in the finance department and the HR department, they're more risk aware. The procurement guys, there's an easier uptake. Ownership goes a bit easier in those departments. But other guys, you do have the challenge, like the musketeers and the marketeers,
Yeah. So what I'm hearing here, so combination of things. So within the organization, there's going to be different levels of business buy-in within the same organization, possibly your finance teams, your HR teams, a little bit more risk aware, better business buy-in there compared to maybe your production guys, your sales guys, more target driven than risk driven. So maybe there's a bit of an activity where there's just educating those users within the organization that they all appreciate risk with this at the same, or manage the risk at the same level. The other point that Emile raised, which I think is a very valid and an important point, is I suppose difficult to get the business to buy in until the business users have understood and agree with the rule set. Emile mentioned that if a company is using an out-the-box rule set and there's some risk there that the business users don't quite understand or they don't agree with, difficult to enforce buy-in if you don't believe in the rules in which you're monitoring or being measured against. So I think, we're very vocal about this ourselves, and we've spoken about this in another podcast, where customizing the rule set is such an important activity for a lot of organizations that maybe lack maturity in the space. We even recommend, say, cut that rule set down, rather manage 50 risks effectively rather than trying to manage 300 risks. So, understand where your GRC maturity is. But Emile, your point there of getting the rule set right is a great starting point, I think, with ensuring you get the necessary business buy-in. If the business users don't understand the rule sets or the risks that's been measured or don't agree with them, then there is going to be resistance from the business, and they're just not going to agree with the results being reported on. And then you also just mentioned there that also the way in which those results are presented is also important. If those results, the access risk reports, are presented to the business users in a way that's not business friendly, if it's pretty technical, very complex, difficult to sort of interpret those reports, again, there's going to be some resistance from the business users because it's just difficult for them to understand what is the risk impact, because those reports are just not presenting the results in a manner in which they can understand. So I guess a very important aspect there is how business friendly is your GRC solution? Does it make sense to the business users? Okay, I guess the one area that we haven't really touched on too much is around ownership. And maybe I can just throw this to you guys and say, we often see that this is a huge challenge for many organizations that we deal with. On the one side, obviously the ownership should sit with the business unit users. That's what the whole podcast is about. But the reality is a lot of the aspects of sort of governance compliance are so technical and so complex that they don't lend themselves to be taken. The business don't want to take ownership of it because of the complexity of it. And so the solutions and the processes, possibly we need to look at splitting ownership and saying, okay, IT, you're responsible for the process and the solutions. Are they reporting correctly? Are the results being presented in a sort of friendly manner? But obviously then the business take ownership then of the decision-making process. What are the ways in which have you guys seen organizations manage the challenge around ownership, where on the one side, all aspects of governance, risk, and compliance are technical and complex, and lends itself more to the IT guys to understand and manage, but the results that come out of those reports are decisions that should be taken by the business users?
I'll make a first comment, and Quintus, feel free to add on to that. But what we have, that you mentioned, the authorizations are quite technical and assigning permissions to users. Now with S4 and using of cloud applications, that's actually becoming even more complex. So for a business user to understand all of those different systems, different complexities that come with that, even if they get all of the information or it's been made available to them, it's often difficult for them to understand all the technical items that's involved with that. So instead of relying solely on the IT, what a lot of companies are doing, they installing a person that fulfills a position between IT and business to help them interpret data and help them and advise them on what is the impact of a specific risk, how do they address it, how do they have an effective control to manage that risk in place. And I think that's where a lot of companies are moving towards, is to still shifting reliance away from IT, moving it to business, but there is a person that has a more technical understanding that is performing a supporting function.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Dudley, the 2 points is obviously getting a product that's business centric, focus on presenting the risk in a way that the business can understand. That is a tremendous help. But back to Emile's point, actually, the risk department or that position is created there between IT. It's quite important that it's actually the business that owes it to the guys who they're now trying to give this accountability, and they need to be a bit of a hand-holding and encouraging and explaining and getting the business to ownership. It's a process of moving that away from the IT side into the business, or not just dumping it with the business and say, well, there, off you go. You need to help those guys and understand and unpack that so that the ownership can. I think in one of our previous sessions, we talked about the fact about the risk rules of customization, and that's also a very nice, good process to help the understand and getting that knowledge over, ownership over to that. So the combination is really help the business by giving somebody who's got the knowledge and get them, on your side. And there we talked about it. Obviously, it's easier for certain departments to take ownership and others, and then also making sure that you have present the results in a way that business can understand and own it.
And I guess then a big part of this is educating the business users on the risks, that they can understand it and be able to make decisions off the back of that. So we've also spoken previously, and we speak a lot around the importance of policies and procedures, and spending the time of defining what are the various policies, procedures around all the use cases associated with the access risk management activities. And Emile, we've seen how well that's worked, because that does serve as sort of a standing operating procedure for the business users, that they understand what is expected of them, what tasks need to be done, what's the frequency of that. But that does go a long way to assisting with this education, with letting the business users know what is expected of them and how are they meant to achieve or perform the tasks that they're responsible for.
Yes, no, that's 100%. So what we do see is companies that don't have that clearly defined process in place, that is actually what also helps in the ownership of risk. So once that policy has been clearly defined, and maybe a very important item there to consider is that a company shouldn't try and implement a policy or a procedure that is not achievable for them. Should be something that they can actually achieve. You mentioned an example of managing 50 risks instead of 300. That could be a policy decision to say, we're focusing on critical and high risks, that we can manage these effectively, ensure we've got mitigating controls in place, and that can then be clearly defined in the policy to advise them on what should they be focusing on first.
I think, Emile, that standard operating procedures also help. Once the business accepted the fact that they're accountable, responsible for it, then of course if you do go across different business processes, say from procurement, purchase order to a vendor master in accounts payable, then the ownership can be decentralized a bit further. And normally what the guidance I normally try to give the client is, listen, focus your master data section of the risk. And that's from a control perspective, the easier to put controls in, but also split those risks up and ownership in the business based on the function. So if you have two functions in conflict, make each of those functions, because it is across the different business processes. So make the procurement owner responsible for the purchase order approvals, and then obviously for the vendor master details, if that's the risk, make those owners. So the combination, once a business, and that's standard operating procedures, normally makes it quite clear, where the ownership is, because you sometimes have a debate between, when it comes to cross business process risks, that the business are saying, but well, who actually owns this risk, because we're in two different areas, and that's where the function ownership becomes in quite handy and accepted.
And I guess that's always going to be a challenge for almost all the segregation of duties, because it's always one function from one business process, often in conflict with a function from another business process, or often two completely different departments within the organization. So finding a logical owner for the one risk can be a challenge itself. Yeah. Okay, so I think then just to summarize, then what do we see then as the solution? Emile, you mentioned look at the rule set, make sure that the business users agree with the rules that are applicable or relevant to the organization. Less is more in many occasions. Two, we mentioned, if possible, find an access control solution that presents the results in a business-friendly manner, in a way in which the converts that technical GRC language into a business-friendly language that will facilitate more informed, quicker decision-making by business users. And then we also spoke about clearly defining responsibility, accountability. Get the IT teams to either take responsibility of the solutions, but the business users will take responsibility of the output of those solutions and the decisions relating to them. And Emile, you mentioned there how some organizations are introducing a new sort of person to sit in between IT and the business, usually someone maybe coming from an IT background but has a very good business understanding. That person will represent the business in many of these decisions. Good. Is there anything else that I've missed, summing all of that up?
Maybe just then lastly, the policies and procedures again, as the summary of all of that to dictate how that process will work, who's responsible for what, and what time they need to perform those activities.
Possibly one of the more important ones. If you can clearly define the policies and procedures, that does then become sort of a standard operating procedure document for the business users. They know exactly what's expected of them, the frequency, and under what conditions certain things can be done, which will be sort of a great guiding document for a lot of the business users. Which is obviously just important of educating the business users on not only the solution, the processes, but the risks that they're responsible for.
Yeah, and I think Dudley also just for business to realize that this is not a quick fix. It is a process, and all the things we discussed now, the policy procedures, the knowledge transfer, all of that is a process, and the business must be aware this is not going to happen overnight. And we discussed, there's some easier uptake and slower uptake, but don't try to think it's going to be, a quick process. It's all these items requires time and some change management, in this process for business to take that.
Yeah, true. Okay, perfect. I think that wraps it up. Emile, Quintus, once again, thank you for joining us. To everyone listening or watching, thank you, and we look forward to the next one. Okay, cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.